I'm starting to see online more and more people becoming concerned that we might all be heading for a revolution. Somehow there's going to be a mixture of the impacts of climate change, bad government, social injustice, and the whole thing will implode. Even quite responsible news sources, and also even people like Professor Michael Mann, one of the most professional, most respected climate scientists, always plays everything straight down the line based on the science. He's concerned the United States might go down. So in this video, we're going to look at the principles of revolutions. We're going to become experts in free market capitalism. We're going to look at a growing injustice all the way around the world. And then we're going to put it all together and try and work out where we're going. I've already made one video where I imagine what it must be like to be living in a society where the impacts of climate change are becoming worse and worse. The society is gradually collapsing. But in that one, it's called Living and Dying in the Climate Apocalypse. In that video, I just assumed governments would act properly and they'd put their economies on a war footing so they could deal with the impacts of climate change and transition to a zero carbon economy as quickly and as efficiently as possible. They would make sure there was enough food for everyone for as long as possible. In this video, I'm going to imagine what it must be like if you didn't have a well-run government and it was corrupt, incompetent, or had favouritism. And then we'll see how revolutions play out in those sorts of situations. First of all, revolutions. And this next part of the video is based on the ideas of Jack Goldstone and his book, Revolutions, A Very Short Introduction. If you're thinking to yourself, well, this is ridiculous, there's no revolution coming. The first rule of revolutions is nobody ever sees them coming. In January 1917, Lenin gave a speech and he said, there will be no revolution in Russia in our lifetime. The revolution happened the next month. People are very cautious about standing up and opposing the governments. The governments have the security forces, they can put you under surveillance, they can send you to prison for years. Nobody wants that. So until revolutions reach a tipping point, nobody ever sees them coming. The next thing to know about revolutions is, although each revolution might appear to have a different starting point, for example, the revolution in Russia is caused by the First World War. I'm thinking about it from a point of view of climate change. Just about every revolution has as its beginning an economic crisis, but all revolutions have the underlying cause of injustice. Humans are social animals, we have a strong sense of right and wrong. Injustice isn't just something we don't like, it's something that disgusts us. Humans are inherently social beings. We care not only about material and financial rewards, but also about social status, belonging and respect. We seem to have a happiness response to fair treatment and a disgust or protest response to unfairness. If you're thinking to yourself, I wonder what might cause a revolution in my country, in my society, and you're looking to the future to try and work out what it might be, you don't need to do that. What you need to do is look at your society now and see the levels of injustice and what those injustices are, because it's quite possible they'll still exist in the future and they'll be the causes of a revolution. The third thing to know about revolutions is they do not happen in the streets. They are not insurrections, riots, rebellions, protests. A revolution happens in the offices of the political elite, the senior civil servants, the generals, the senior police officers. They happen when they believe either it's physically impossible for them to carry on supporting the current political system, or they decide they no longer believe in it and choose not to support it. And these sorts of revolutions happen much more often than you think. For example, Donald Trump wants the United States Armed Forces to be loyal to him. The generals are quite keen to point out they take an oath of allegiance to the Constitution and not to any one individual. In Britain, one of our shortest serving Prime Ministers, Liz Truss, had a very ambitious economic policy. She wanted to increase government spending, cut taxation. The government would have had to borrow a lot more money. Either the Bank of England decided it would be impossible for the government to borrow that much more money, or the Bank of England decided it didn't support her policy. And without the Bank of England support, the United Kingdom's Reserve Bank, without the Bank of England support, she had to go. Without the Bank of England, Truss could have tried her plan without institutional constraint, but she would have had to convince investors all over the world of the UK's economic stability. It is hard to see how she could have succeeded. When right-wing politicians complain the deep state is stopping them from doing what they want, they have got a point. You can sum up all these ideas about revolution in the revolution that happened in South Africa when they got rid of apartheid. You might think Nelson Mandela was the revolutionary, but he wasn't, because he'd been in prison for 27 years by that time. There was a violent uprising in the streets. Popular uprisings are quite often key parts of revolutions, but they're just one more straw that sort of breaks the camel's back. The revolution in South Africa happened towards the end of 1989, when the political elite got rid of one president called Botha, who believed in apartheid, and they brought in another president called de Klerk, who did not believe in apartheid. That was at the end of 89. By the beginning of 1990, Nelson Mandela had been released from prison. It took 5 or 6 years for elections to come, but the revolution happened when they changed presidents. And as is common with lots of revolutions, it was an economic crisis that started the revolution. The imposition of international sanctions on the country began economic pressure that saw the unravelling of apartheid. The most damaging isolation was the denial of investment funds and the boycott of South African investments, particularly by influential universities and foundations in the United States. These boycotts limited the capital available to South African businesses. They didn't need any new ideology for their revolution. All they had to do was increase the number of people who had the vote. So a theme of revolutions, at least for this video, is the underlying cause is social injustice, and you can get rid of that social injustice by being more democratic. So if you live in a country that has high levels of injustice, it's quite possible that's because you don't live in a democracy, or your democracy is not working well. And the key aspects of the democracy, a free press, an independent judiciary, the right to protest, all those other things aren't working well. If you live in a country with first past the post electoral system rather than proportional representation, maybe that could lead to injustice, because it doesn't fully represent the beliefs of the people you're representing. Using this way of understanding revolutions, Britain had a revolution between the First and Second World War. Soldiers of the Second War were totally different to those of the First War because they were educated. In the First War, the best recruiting sergeant was starvation off the streets. You didn't enlist in the army unless you were starving. And what was the revolution Britain had? Before the First World War, no woman had the vote, and very few working class men had the vote. After the First World War, everyone had the vote, men and women. And it just changed society. So less injustice, more democracy. That's what you need if you want to avoid a revolution. If there is going to be one, we need to know what the injustice is that goes all the way around the world and will affect all of us. Well, in the last 2 years, 2/3 of all the new wealth that's been created has gone to the wealthiest 1%. That means that 1/3 of the wealth that's been created has to be shared out amongst the 99% of everyone else. It's getting to be such a problem, in Britain at least. Growing numbers of people can't afford to feed themselves, can't afford to pay for electricity. But it's a global problem that's getting worse. Inequality is growing for more than 70% of the global population, exacerbating the risks of divisions and hampering economic and social development. Ever since the end of the Second World War, there's been a great improvement in people's living standards all the way around the world. Poverty's down, life expectancy's up. That is now coming to an end, because the economy is now moving, the global economy is now moving to allow the very wealthiest people to become much more wealthy. You can see this in this chart. It's based in the United States of America. For this video, most of my data is based on either the United Kingdom or the United States. It's just easier. I can't do the whole world, but I think there's a global problem, so I think that will be valid. Whatever country you're in, I'm guessing you're seeing the same sorts of things. As you can see, in the last 40 years, the wealthiest 1% of people in the United States have done very well. The wealthiest 10% have quite well. The 90% of everyone else, there's no improvement there at all, is there? Now, you need to become experts in free market capitalism. And in case you think, well, this video is some sort of communist propaganda video, this next section is going to be based on the ideas of Adam Smith, who's regarded as the father of capitalism. And not just any old capitalism, but free market capitalism. And you can sum up his ideas by saying, Even though a business or a person might appear to be acting selfishly by maximising their own profits, by providing useful goods and services, they're doing a public good. That's all it is. You're now an expert in Adam Smith's ideas, but there's lots of things that follow from that, which makes me think what people hoped capitalism would be, what Adam Smith thought capitalism ought to be, and what we have now are completely different. Our system has somehow got lost along the way. By pursuing their own interest, they frequently promote that of their society more effectively than when he really intends to promote it. Adam Smith believed to have a free market capitalist economy, you needed to have good levels of competition, and you could tell if you had good competition by having low profits and high wages. He thought businesses should have low profits, because if there was one business that was particularly successful, there'd be competition. People would move in and they'd provide the same sorts of goods and services, so profits would go down. But you would need to pay the workers properly, so they're well motivated, and also a healthy economy needs lots of people, so that would be a sign if you have low profits and high wages. When stocks of many rich merchants are turned into the same trade, their mutual competition naturally tends to lower its profit. Where wages are high, accordingly, we shall always find the workmen more active, diligent and expeditious than when they are low. What's surprising about Adam Smith, the father of capitalism, is he has quite a strong sense of right and wrong, and he's quite aware of the power business owners have compared to that of the ordinary working people. Whenever the legislator attempts to regulate the differences between the masters and their workmen, its councillors are always the masters, so he is fully aware that people who own the businesses have more political influence, and that needs to be something you take into account. When the regulation therefore is in favour of the workmen, it is always just and equitable, but it is sometimes otherwise when in the favour of the masters, who's very concerned about trusting the masters. High wages and low profits were a symptom of a healthy economy, but for Adam Smith they're also an important aspect of it, because he thought to have an economy that benefits everyone and stops the business people becoming too powerful and getting too much influence, you needed to have the wealth evenly spread throughout the economy. And an important aspect of that, to make sure the wealthy didn't get too much money, was fair taxation. The necessaries of life occasion the great expense of the poor. They find it difficult to get food, and the greater part of their little revenue is spent in getting it. It's like Britain now, isn't it? Growing numbers of people can't afford to buy food. It is not very unreasonable that the rich should contribute to the public expense. Sounds reasonable. Not only in proportion to their revenue, but something more than in that proportion. Sounds fair, but that's not the society we live in now. Adam Smith was concerned that the wealthy people might get too much influence, but also that if they had too much money, they would stop consuming, because they already had enough houses and clothes and food and everything they could possibly want, and they would instead start buying assets. They would start buying shares and property and houses and land, and they would start to get an income from that. And now you're experts in free market capitalism, I'm sure you can see what the problem is. Adam Smith thought to have a good capitalist economy, you needed people providing useful goods and services. As soon as you start buying assets, you don't rely on providing useful goods and services and being rewarded for those. You just own things, and you almost like take a tax for something you haven't really contributed to. So if they bought land, for example, the farmer who farmed on that land would be providing useful goods and services. The wealthy person who just owned the land and hadn't done anything towards it was just really charging a tax, weren't they? They weren't providing useful goods and services that were a public good. As soon as the land of any country has all become private property, the landlords, like all other men, love to reap what they never sowed and demand a rent even from its natural produce. And if the wealthy got to be too wealthy, how would they use their power? They would use it to campaign for monopolies. Remember, free market capitalism was all about not having monopolies. To narrow the competition must always be against the interest of the public, and can only serve to enable the dealers by raising their profits above what they would naturally be. And the people who would suffer from monopolies? In every different branch, the oppression of the poor must establish the monopoly of the rich, who, by engrossing the whole trade to themselves, will be able to make very large profits. Adam Smith was writing 250 years ago in 1776, a very revolutionary year. As we'll see now, comparing it to what our economy is like now, we'll see how prescient he was. The next part of this video is based on the ideas of the Gary Economics YouTube channel. He's a one-time city trader, and now he thinks of himself as an injustice economist. We need to have fair taxation, as Adam Smith said. Have we got fair taxation in our current system? Well, in the United States of America, the average income tax rate for a billionaire is 8%. Don't take my word for it, this is what the White House has to say about it. Many of these wealthy Americans are able to pay an average income tax rate of just 8% on their full incomes, a lower rate than many firefighters or teachers. To finally address this glaring iniquity, the President's budget includes a 25% minimum tax on the wealthiest, 0.01%, those with wealth of more than $100 million. There's something there which is sometimes seen to be a cause of revolutions. The President of the United States of America has realised there's a problem. The very wealthiest people only have an income tax rate of 8%. And they're saying, in the future, we're going to make sure they have a minimum income tax rate of 25%. So they're sort of saying, we know there's a problem and we're trying to fix it, but by only charging them 25% tax, they're still taxing them less than the average wealthy person in America. I think at the moment, the top income tax rate in the United States is 37%. So the President says, we know there's a problem, we're not really taking it seriously. And it's those sorts of things that annoy people. They can say to themselves, the government is still, even though it pretends to care, it doesn't really care. So keep that in mind for later on. One of the reasons the wealthy people in the world have got so wealthy at the moment is because they pay so little tax. In 1980, in Britain and in the United States, I think the top income tax rate was 70%, 70%. By 1998 in the United States, it had gone down to 27% or 28%. 28%. And why did they do that? There was an idea called trickle-down economics. The idea was you didn't tax the wealthy so much, they spent more of their money, it boosted the economy. But as Adam Smith realised 250 years ago, if you let the wealthy people have more money, they don't buy consumer goods, they don't use it to boost the economy, they use it instead to buy assets, which makes themselves even richer. And you can see this in the chart we saw at the beginning of the video. You can see 1980 is when the top wealthiest 1% of people in the United States, they really became very wealthy. And around about that time, government borrowing goes up because they're not getting so much tax in, they need to borrow more money. Who do they borrow it from? China, partly China, but also the very wealthiest people who have now got more money. They want to invest in safe investments like government gilts, government borrowing, and instead of providing useful goods and services, the wealthy are now able to have quite a good living just by charging interest to the government, when really that money they're giving to the government, they should really be giving in tax and not charging a rate for it. The same thing happened in Britain. Governments must realise this is a problem, but instead of trying to do something about it, instead of having a just tax system that stops the wealthy people becoming very wealthy and getting too much political influence, instead governments are competing with each other to charge lower and lower rates of tax to the wealthy, because they think by encouraging the wealthy to come to their country, they'll get some economic benefit. His clients were keen to move to Italy, which introduced a scheme through which rich people could pay a flat tax of just 100,000 euros, no matter how much money they earned. France, Greece, Cyprus, Malta, Portugal and Spain have similar schemes designed to attract the wealthy and internationally mobile elite. It didn't used to be like this. 40 years ago, Britain had a Prime Minister called Margaret Thatcher. She wanted to increase the number of people in Britain who own their own house. She thought, if you have a stake in your society, a property owning democracy she called it, then you'd feel more involved, you'd work harder, it would just boost the economy. And so she passed a policy that allowed people, if they were living in social housing, in Britain we call them council houses because they're built by the council and you rented them from the council. If you could buy your own house that was previously social housing, then you would look after it, you'd feel you'd made some progress in life. 40 years later, 40% of all the social housing that was sold off to ordinary people has now been bought up by wealthy people who now rent it out privately. In fact, the wealthy are so wealthy now, they don't just buy houses one or two at a time, they buy them by the thousand. And as Adam Smith was concerned, they're not doing anything useful towards the construction of the houses. They don't buy the land and then develop it and go through all the planning regulations and construction and hire the builders to come and do the work. They wait for the houses to be built, buy them up, rent them on to people who would be quite happy to buy them anyway. There's a great shortage of housing in Britain. Housing is very expensive, but people would like to be able to own their own house rather than have to rent it from someone else who hasn't really done anything constructive towards it apart from just having lots of money and buying it up. It's got to be such a problem now that some people can no longer afford to have families, and the number of children people are having in Britain and in other parts of the world is in decline. Well, if you can't afford a house, if you can't afford to bring up a family, you don't really have anything to hold on to do. If there's a risk of revolution, what have you got to lose? The wealthy people now in Britain are so wealthy that they no longer have to provide useful goods and services to provide a public good. In Britain, 60% of all the wealthiest people inherited their money rather than earning it. Wealth is increasingly inherited, not earned. Inheritance, not hard work, is the principal route to wealth ownership, constituting 60% of all private wealth in the UK. What would Adam Smith have thought about that? In the United States, the wealthiest 0.1% of people get between half and 70% of their income through sources that don't include doing any work. The landlord demands a rent even for unimproved land, and the supposed interest or profit upon the expense of the improvement is generally an addition to the original rent. If we put our climate change hats back on again, sometimes you see governments will say, there's so much we need to do to get to a zero carbon economy, just about everything in the human world has to change. It's going to be very expensive, it's going to be very difficult. We're going to need the help of the private sector. Well, where are they going to get the money from to pay for it all? Well, the very wealthiest people will be delighted to make money out of this. Since the whole human world has to change, it's quite possible the wealthiest people will end up owning large parts of it, and we'll just end up paying them to use the things we used to use for free. This isn't a capitalist economy, is it? We're now in an economy which is quite different, but there is a word for it. If the wealthiest people own everything, you pay a rent to use it. It's a bit like feudalism, isn't it? Where you had the lord of the manor, the people who farmed the land didn't own the land, the lord of the manor owned that, possibly because he was friends of the king, and everyone paid a tax to him. Do you think there's a revolution coming? But there's one more aspect to this in our modern economy. The wealthy people are so rich now that the economy is gradually transitioning to serve their demands. So private jet use, super yachts, these businesses are all booming. It's got so bad now, there are even businesses that offer a dedicated service for flying pets on private jets. That's the general principles of how our economy's got a bit lost and is serving a very small number of wealthy people rather than the whole public benefit. But there's just a couple more things I've got about business. It's going on a bit, this video. I'm allowed to say that because I'm doing it and it is going on a bit. So just very quickly, in the United States, when there was more unionisation, the wealthy people weren't quite so wealthy. As unionisation has gone into decline, the wealthy people have become wealthier, which is what Adam Smith thought would happen, didn't he? He thought, if the governments listen to the business owners, the ordinary working people will suffer. So that's the first point. Second point is, if I can find it, monopolies. Warren Buffett, one of the world's most famous investors, has something called his moat principle, which is where he invests in businesses which are difficult for other businesses to compete with. There are barriers to market entry, whatever they are. So there's someone who's actually making money out of monopolies, and deliberately so. And you might think, well, if we live in a free market capitalist economy, why don't governments change the regulations to make it easier to compete? Good question. There are businesses like Facebook and Twitter, or X as it's called now. They're quite simple systems. They're only so successful, so valuable, because they're monopolies. A computer system like Twitter or Facebook, where you all want to communicate with everyone, only works properly if everyone is on the same system. There are ways to regulate these things. Why don't governments do it? Good question. The idea that a successful business will have competition is one of the reasons that Britain did so well in the Industrial Revolution, because we had the patent system. If you came up with a good invention, you patented it, you published it so everyone could see what it was. They could use your idea, they'd pay you a royalty for using it, so you benefited from it. Now the patent system, which was so useful in the Industrial Revolution, is now in some ways being abused by the big pharmaceutical companies to stop people using their idea rather than as a way to share it. And then finally, something from Oxfam in America that sums up the state of our economy. Governments are empowering a small number of corporations to exert extraordinary influence over economies and politics. These monopolies have a huge role in shaping the lives of ordinary people around the world, from influencing how much we are paid to the foods we can eat and can afford, and medicines we can access. Well, all these theoretical concerns have real-world implications. For example, in Britain, there are nearly 4 million people who are destitute. And if you're destitute, that means maybe you can just about to afford food, but you can't afford new clothes or soap or any of the things you need to really live your life with some sort of dignity. Approximately 3.8 million people experienced destitution in 2022, including around 1 million children. This is almost 2.5 times the number of people in 2017 and nearly triple the number of children. It's serious, and it's getting worse. Growing number of people are struggling to afford to meet their most basic physical needs to stay warm, dry, clean and fed. Now, do you think those 4 million people are destitute because it's their own fault, because they're lazy or incompetent or something? Or do you think the problem is we live in an economy, in a society that doesn't have the general public good as its aim, but really benefits a small number of very wealthy people? Are you disgusted by this yet? Well, it doesn't matter what you think or what I think. When a great majority of people in a society are disgusted by the injustice, if a large number of people can't afford to feed themselves, if they can't afford to bring up families, if they have very little stake in society, when an economic crisis comes, possibly due to the impacts of climate change, it doesn't take that much for a revolution to happen, because so many people will have so little to lose. When elites and popular groups blame the regime for unjust conditions, people will rise against it. Now we come to the part of the video where we find out what it's like to live in a society that's having a revolution. I've made one video already, Living and Dying in the Climate Apocalypse, where governments acted properly as their countries encountered worse and worse impacts from climate change. And those countries had high levels of social cohesion, so they all stuck together and helped each other out. There's a great feeling of camaraderie. Those countries will take one fork in the road. But this video, we're going down a different fork. We're going down the fork in the road your country will take if your government is corrupt, incompetent, has favourites, and it doesn't have that high levels of social cohesion. Instead, there are great levels of injustice because your democratic system isn't working properly. It doesn't properly reflect the views of the society it represents. The impacts of climate change get worse and worse. Life becomes more difficult. The global economy is in decline because countries all the way around the world are being affected by climate change. Some countries in the tropics are collapsing. Some countries, like Bangladesh, are being affected by sea level rises. Water is becoming more scarce. There are more severe droughts and floods and storms and heat waves. The economy in your own country is suffering, water shortages, food supplies disrupted. What turns poverty or inequality into a motivation for revolution? It is the belief that these conditions are not inevitable but arise from the faults of the regime. Life is very difficult because of climate change, but if people instead blame the government, possibly quite fairly, because the government isn't doing a good job of helping you cope with climate change, that's when revolutions become possible. Although revolutions are quite rare things, sometimes countries can go for centuries with high levels of injustice. Only when elites and popular groups blame the regime for unjust conditions, whether arising from the regime's incompetence, corruption or favouritism for certain groups at the expense of others, will people rise against it. So, climate change puts your economy into decline, makes your life more and more difficult. At the same time, the wealthy people are going to carry on getting wealthier and wealthier. Why is climate change going to continue to get worse? Because we never do enough to tackle it. Why are the rich people going to continue to become richer and richer? Because we never do enough to tackle it. So anyway, in the end, that was the economy going down, and that's the rich people going up. In the end, these 2 points cross, and you get to sort of a critical tipping point. There may be shortages of land or work, or excessive rents, or falling real wages and growing banditry, so that ordinary people are unsettled and distressed. Whatever the impacts of climate change are in the distant future, those are the sorts of things they're impacting. And you might think, well, surely during a very serious emergency like climate change or the COVID pandemic, governments would act properly that time. Maybe normally they're a bit random, they like to benefit themselves, but in an emergency they'll act properly. Well, no, in Britain, during the COVID pandemic, the then government, that was run by the Conservative Party, they set up what they called a VIP lane, and that was a way their supporters, or people who are friends of the government, could get preferential treatment when it came to getting government contracts. On average, VIP lane suppliers were paid 80% more per unit than other suppliers. Some contracts were agreed at more than 4 times the average price. It's quite possible in a future national emergency, your government won't be prioritising you, it will be prioritising making money for it itself and for its friends. Many elites and popular groups view the rulers and other elites as unjust. They are drawn to heterodox beliefs or ideologies that make sense of their grievances and offer solutions through social change. Heterodox beliefs are those that are unusual or revolutionary. So it's in the distant future, climate change is causing your society to collapse, the government isn't acting properly, or maybe it's seen not to be acting properly. For example, maybe if there are food shortages and the people think the government isn't distributing the food fairly, maybe they think they're giving the food to the very wealthiest people who have been supporting them, have financially benefited the government. Maybe the police don't want to put down riots caused by starvation because the people think there's food available but the government's holding it back for some reason. Maybe the police have more sympathy with the ordinary people who are rioting than they do with the government, who are supposed to be keeping things going and are supposed to be benefiting the public. Elites are no longer unified, but instead have become divided into mutually suspicious and distrusting groups. The elites are becoming divided. Some people, like the police, who are at the sharp end of what's going on, maybe are less supportive. Maybe the people inside the government itself, who have much easier lives, who are much more supportive of the government, but things are becoming divided. Even now, though, people think a revolution is not going to come. Nobody wants to stand up and say, let's have a revolution, because they don't want to go to prison. The political elite will hide any weaknesses they might have because they don't want to encourage people to rise up, and they want the public to have confidence in them. People think they're positive. There might be problems now. We can get the government to change its ways. Right up until the time of the Revolution in the United States in 1776, George Washington and Benjamin Franklin declared they were loyal Englishmen until the revolution comes. So no one thinks the revolution's coming, but you can engage constructively with the government. Popular groups find their efforts are not providing them with expected rewards or outcomes. The government might try and act, but will only show how out of touch they are. Rulers may attempt reforms aiming to win elite or popular support and to gain additional resources, but these are usually too little and too late and merely create more uncertainty and fresh opposition. Injustice has put society on a tipping point. This is how revolutions arrive over time as society shifts from a condition of stable equilibrium to unstable equilibrium. In this state, it doesn't take much for the revolution to begin. Then, even a small disorder can set off an accelerating movement towards greater disorder and the overturning of the existing regime. This is why no one ever spots a revolution coming, because once you're in this critical tipping point, even the smallest thing can tip things over into revolution. And remember, until now, the political elite have been hiding their weaknesses. They want to try and keep public confidence for as long as they can. People don't realise how critical things are until it's too late. The degree to which other groups sympathise with protests, or that there is dissatisfaction in the military and the police, may not be visible until it's too late. There might be violence in the street, there might be a popular uprising that will just add pressure to the government, but the revolution only happens when the political elite give up. Elites may hide their growing discord and opposition until they seize the opportunity to act against the regime. At last, we've got to the revolution. Who are the revolutionaries going to be? Who are the members of the political elite who either think it's physically no longer possible to carry on, or they no longer believe in the system? Well, they've already featured in the video. They've already got rid of one Prime Minister in an economic crisis caused by increased injustice because people are getting very wealthy and increased impacts from climate change. An economic crisis has come about, and the people who are going to sort it out are the Bank of England. When economic growth is so uneven that the poor and even middle classes fall further behind while a small elite grow rapidly richer, sounds familiar, doesn't it? Then economic changes will be widely seen as unjust, creating popular grievances and alienating and dividing the elites. The Bank of England can't change economic policy. Well, that's the government's job anyway. But the Bank of England does have a lot of power, as we've already seen. Once a regime has been weakened, key elites have defected, and revolutionaries at the heart of the armies or popular revolts have seized power. A revolution has begun. Can you imagine that? You switch on your television, there's the head of your reserve bank, whichever country you're in, is sat there, maybe with a Kalashnikov or something. Maybe not a Kalashnikov. How are they going to sell you this idea? Although the elites may stress abstractions such as the evils of capitalism or the importance of natural rights, the most effective narratives of resistance also draw on stories of heroes who fought for justice in times past. The Bank of England was formed in 1694 after the British lost the battle with the French. The Bank of England since then has regularly had to bail out the British government and keep things going. In fact, if you Google Bank of England crisis, you'll be surprised that Britain has kept going for as long as it has. But it won't sell it to the people on some economic thing. It will just sell it on the idea of, well, this is business as usual. The Bank of England is always saving you. This is just one more example. What works best are vague or utopian promises of better times ahead, combined with a detailed and emotionally powerful depiction of the intolerable injustice. In my mad idea of what a revolution would be like, with the Bank of England leading the revolution, suddenly there's no government debt. Suddenly, if you're renting a house, maybe you just own the houses. Property redistribution is common in a revolution. You might think, oh, what about my pension? What about if I own a house and rent it out to people? Remember, already there are 4 million people in Britain who are nearly destitute. A significant number of people struggle to pay the rent, can no longer afford to have families. If this is going to get worse and worse, by the time a revolution could come, so many people have such a little stake in society that if the stock market was to crash, they wouldn't care. That things become so unjust that in the end the Bank of England just gives up on the financial system. All debts are abolished. Everyone owns their house, whether you're renting it or not. I must admit, compared to some of my other videos, this one has got lots of my imagination and far fewer scientific facts. The one thing I will ask though, and people normally say this on YouTube, click the like button and leave a comment. I don't really understand, if we're not going to have a revolution, how things will end. The richer get richer and richer. Climate change makes things more and more difficult. I can't see a way of either of them stopping. So leave a comment if you have a better idea. Of course, now you're all experts in revolutions. You know that you only have high levels of injustice. You're only in danger of having a revolution if there's something wrong with your political system and your democracy is not working very well. Whatever happens though, the sooner it gets sorted out, possibly the sooner we have a revolution, the better, because the sooner a revolution happens, the more likely the political elite, the head of the Bank of England, the judges, the senior civil servants, the more likely they are to still be solid people who have a strong sense of right and wrong and want to do their public duty. If injustice levels are going to continue to increase, if the wealthy are going to get more and more political influence, if the prime ministers, the presidents don't work in the public interest but use their power to almost corrupt the whole system, you know, what if the Bank of England was a very wealthy person, or run by very wealthy people who didn't have the public interest at heart and didn't get rid of Liz Truss when she made some mistakes? What if the President of the United States used his position, for example, to corrupt the United States Supreme Court? So the sooner there's a revolution, the sooner we can get rid of the injustices, the better. The longer it goes on, the more dangerous a revolution would have to be, because it would no longer be a peaceful thing, where the Bank of England just does some accountancy, bankrupts all the wealthy people, but it really could be then a much more dangerous, much more violent revolution. Revolutions are long processes, not simple events, and their outcomes may range from democracy to renewed dictatorship. This is a long video. If you're still watching, well done. With increasing levels of injustice, with increasing impacts of climate change, a revolution, although they're not predictable, although a society can go on for hundreds of years with high levels of injustice, a revolution does seem more and more likely. And my idea from the previous video, living and dying in the climate apocalypse, where I thought the governments would be competent, that seems less likely.